Welcome to PENSARE Basketball. We're going to talk about the Toronto Raptors bias problem. Do the Raptors have a bias problem? Because for me, as someone who has covered this team for quite a few years now, I can summarize the last 5 years of Toronto Raptors basketball with one four-letter word, and that is bias. So, what is the bias at play? How many biases are at play? Is bias even a bad thing? I think we got to talk about this. And I think that we want to talk about this because it's a continuation of a strand of thought of trying to connect things that aren't necessarily connected to basketball and showing you how deeply connected they are, in fact, to basketball. And I think bias is very strongly at play when we discuss the Kawhi Leonard situation over the last few days. We have certainly seen some people rush to his defense because he's their favorite player, and we have seen some people very quick to accuse Steve Ballmer because they have a particular aversion towards billionaires that stems from childhood and hating rich people. And I think that biases can be okay as long as you know that you're biased. It's okay to admit that you have a bias. I think the problem becomes when biases exist under the surface. So, in as many ways as I believe that this conversation will be strongly about the Toronto Raptors, I also hope that some element of this conversation can help you in your life as not only a Raptor fan to understand when you say so and so is better than so and so, or this is a bad move, or this is a bad trade, which biases are at play forming your decision. That can be very impressively important for you, but also, this can be used in your day to day life when you decide whether to buy a home or not buy a home, whether you choose one job over another job, whether you choose to quit your job and start a business. There's all sorts of biases at play. And I think the only way a bias becomes a really big problem is when you are working without the knowledge that you are biased. This stems also from my desire to give back. Obviously, those things take precedent. And so many content creators end up confused about what to do with their off season. What do I do? Do I just post less? Do I make fewer videos? Do I just talk about the past season, project random, things about the future season? Or do I perhaps take a moment to give the audience, my core audience, a chance perhaps to better inform their viewing experience of the upcoming season? And I think that this live can help in that regard. So let's talk about some of those biases, and I'll give you definitely, if you are a member, shout outs to the members who have chat privileges right now. You can certainly let me know if some of these biases you can find examples in Raptors history, because we will certainly look at the last 5, 6 years of management under Masai Ujiri, also how fans talk, and talk about how these certain biases come to play. Because these two men on the screen right now, Pascal Siakam and Scotty Barnes, I think they both represent a series of biases. So let's talk about some of those biases. Number one is present bias. Let's define it. A present bias is a tendency to give stronger weight to immediate rewards or experiences over future ones, even if the future ones are larger or more beneficial. The future is not always more fruitful or better than the present. And that's where things become a little bit murky when you have a present bias versus a future bias, which we'll talk about as well, because you naturally ascribe more value to one over the other without there being any merit or reason to do so, if that makes sense. So, for instance, the entire discussion around Toronto Raptorland for the last 5 years has been Scotty timeline, Siakam timeline. And now, when Siakam goes to the finals with the Indiana Pacers and performs admirably, the topic comes up again. Will Scotty ever be good enough to do what Siakam did this past season? Of course, the people overreacting have a bit of a present bias. They're watching the Indiana Pacers do something amazing that they're not sure the Raptors will ever be able to do with Scotty Barnes. People with perhaps a future bias will scoff off the present accomplishments of Siakam, which are tremendous, and just chalk it up to, but whatever we get with Scotty will be better because it is in the future. There's nothing inherently good or bad about the present or the future or the past. So it's important. Example, choosing to watch Netflix. This is something that you could probably use in your own life. Choosing to watch Netflix instead of studying for an exam next week because the immediate pleasure outweighs the future benefit of good grades. I think many of us have, it's a spectrum, past, present, future. I think many people veer towards past, present, as opposed to present, future. Some people veer present, future, as opposed to present, past. Some people are firmly present, which is probably the best of all outcomes. Some people are firmly future, which causes them to not learn enough from the past and perhaps go way, way, way away from the present and just focus solely on the future. I think imbalances are bad in general. I think not acknowledging your imbalance is even worse. So it's important to realize that yes, sometimes procrastination, the act of procrastination is, in fact, a present bias. It's harder to start the hard thing than it is to do an easy thing right now. Many, many times I'll catch myself saying, what can I do to make future Rob's day better tomorrow? Right? This is a question that I ask myself as I'm winding down the end of the day. So I'll say, think of it as you are night shift, night shift, alternating like security guards, right? So when I did work security when I was 19 years old, oftentimes I would ask myself the question as my shift was winding down, what is it that I can do to make the night shift guy, or if I was the night shift guy, the day shift guy, what can I do to make his job easier? Well, I can make detailed reports. I can give him a nice brief. I can be ready to go when he's ready. So I'm not taking a patrol when he shows up. So wasting his time. I can possibly stock the fridge as a nice gesture if I know a birthday is coming up. There's a lot of things that I can do to make this guy's life a little bit easier, right? And that's kind of the same treatment you got to give to yourself when you're talking about present, future, past. Is at night when you're tired and you don't want to do the hard thing, which is write out your planner for the next day, fill in your calendar, brush your teeth. These things are all like going to perhaps drain time and energy that you don't feel you have in this moment. Even, for instance, you're sleepy at 5 p.m., you're a little bit tired. What's the natural thing to do? If you have a present bias, the natural thing to do is to dose yourself with coffee because that will help you at 5 p.m. What it will also do, however, it will hurt your sleep at 11 p.m. So the present bias is not a great thing necessarily provided you don't acknowledge it. A form of time inconsistent decision making. I think this is also very, very linked to the Toronto Raptors. There is, of course, the flip side of this, which is the past bias. Some people, we say they're stuck in the past. What does that mean? Well, this happened before, so it'll keep happening, right? To define past bias is a tendency to overvalue or overly focus on past experiences or decisions, often leading to resistance to change or regret based thinking. I know a lot of people who are stuck in the past. I'm sure you do too. An example, sticking with a failing investment because you've already put a lot of money into it. I have been guilty of this. I'm sure anyone who's invested has been guilty of this. And there's a lot of biases at play when you are, in fact, investing. There is a future bias that is linked to a past bias. The past, I put money into this stock. I did research. I know what I'm doing. The present, which is admitting that you're wrong, that you're that you save yourself money in the future, and the future bias and play with the past bias causes you to miss the present opportunity to withdraw your funds and cut your losses. And the future is seductive because what if the money goes back up? What if the stock goes back up? Key concept here, right? Can result in emotional inertia or difficulty adapting and related to nostalgia, regret aversion, or status quo bias. Keep things as they are, right? Future bias, right? Future bias is a tendency to overestimate or idealize the future, often believing things will be better or that you'll behave more rationally later, even if you don't change current behaviors. Well, if you keep doing the same thing over and over again, it's reasonable to expect that your results won't change drastically, right? If you keep eating potato chips, the six pack washboard abs are probably not going to be in your future unless you pull a Drake, right? If you continue to belittle your coworkers and be difficult at work, its chances are that your situation is not going to improve with them, right? But of course, there is this idea that well, when I quit this job and I go get another job, even if my behavior doesn't change, that room will adapt to me differently than this room. And while it is possible that that group may be a little bit more forgiving of your shitty personality, it's very unlikely. And more than likely, if you have this sort of bias, you're less likely to focus on things you can do in the future, uh, in the present to improve your future. What I'm trying to hammer home at is the best way to live ideally is with a very strong awareness of all these biases, catching these biases when they are in fact at play, and then also having a wide spectrum of biases to balance all the biases out. So maybe you work with a little bit of a future bias, but you also have a present bias to counteract it, right? Example, you'll start eating healthy next month, despite having the exact same thing several times before, having said the same thing several times before, right? There's just always this idealized version of ourselves in the future. Oh, I'll have more time with my kids when I retire, but it's like you don't actually have the foundational awareness to create time now. You'll always find a reason to be busy later, right? I'll go to the gym, when work slows down. It's like, nah, you won't. You probably won't because you'll find another reason. This idealized future self that is suddenly free from all the shackles that present us is facing denies or loses. That's not the right word. Denies and loses are not the right words. The word is robs us of the opportunity, or perhaps deprives us the opportunity to make a change today, which would not be a present bias, but rather the logical thing to do because all you really do have is 10 toes down in this moment. What you have right now is an ability to not only reflect on the past, learn from the past, influence the future, but also embrace the present. This day is not coming back, right? We are in September 6th, 3:28 p.m. It will never be September 6th, 2025, 3:28 p.m. ever again. This is your last chance to make most out of this moment. You're here, you're watching this. What are you doing this instead of doing something else? I don't know. But my hope is that in less than 55 minutes, I give you a blueprint that'll help your life and also help you understand the Toronto Raptors. We will get to the Raptors part very shortly, but we do need to define some terms. Key concepts involves optimism bias or planning fallacy can delay action under the illusion that future you will fix things. Again, taking power away from yourself in the present on the false pretense that you will have it somehow magically figured out in the future. A projection bias is a tendency to assume that your future preferences, emotions, or behaviors will be the same as your current ones. This idea of projecting present to future, things will remain the same, things will be exactly as they are, things will bounce back. This is what people say when the real estate market has always gone up, so it'll always go up. This is a projection bias. You are projecting the past onto the future, and the future does not necessarily do exactly what the past does. Shout out to you in 1982 if you projected cryptocurrencies. You probably didn't. Shopping while hungry and buying more food than you'll want later, assuming you'll want that much when you're not going to be hungry anymore. That's a good point. Here's a fun little strategy. Don't go grocery shopping when you're hungry. When you're hungry, you naturally crave more sugar. You'll make worse decisions. Key concept can lead to poor long term planning and distorts predictions of future desires or needs. Now, I give you this little chart to study, if you will, in terms of biases present, past, future, and projection. The focus of the present is now versus the future. Past is past decisions. Future bias is idealized future, and projection bias is a future self. The distortion is one overvalues immediate rewards, the other over attaches to past actions, the other overly optimistic about future behavior, and the other assumes a future self is like the current self, which is never true. You are not going to be the same person tomorrow that you were today. It's not possible. It's literally not possible. Your cells change, right? So I will direct you to one of the most famous movies of all time, and that is Jurassic Park. Cinema happens to be one of my key things. I am a filmmaker, and so sometimes I think about cinema as a way to think about life. This movie came out in 1993. It is a classic. I'm assuming if you're watching me, you've probably watched Jurassic Park or one of the subsequent ones, but what I want to hone in on is the original. There are significant biases at play with all the main characters of Jurassic Park, with the exception of two. And even those two are not exactly immune. But if you talk about Alan Grant, what is the bias of Alan Grant in Jurassic Park? He has a very strong past bias, and he has a deep fear of the future. He's always afraid of technology, losing his job, etc. Even his aversion or disdain for children is a representation of the future. Like, he has a past bias because children are the future. He's afraid of the future, so he remains stuck in the past. Consider John Hammond, the architect of Jurassic Park. He misses his daughter's, crisis to deal with some sort of there's a scene in the beginning of Jurassic Park where a raptor tears apart a park employee, which subsequently leads to an investigation by the lawyers and investors into Jurassic Park. The lawyer shows up to meet with Hammond, but Hammond isn't there because he's allegedly helping his sister or his daughter, I apologize, working through a difficult divorce. But of course, he's not actually doing that. He's flown over to meet with Ellie Sattler and Alan Grant. Why? Because he is securing the future of the park by getting them to sign on as credible expert witnesses or whatever they are. It's interesting that when he flies into their dig site, they have uncovered, a dinosaur bone, and he doesn't care. It's interesting that his park employee has died and he doesn't seem to care that much. Nothing really matters in the present to him because he has a past and a future obsession. He's obsessed with the past because the flea circus, mommy, the fleas, oh my God, I want to make something real. I failed before. And the future, which is, of course, creating something that, like Jurassic Park, the present doesn't matter to him. He has a bias. He's blind to the present. Nedry is blind to past loyalty. Present, he only cares about the future payoff. He doesn't care. Sattler is an extension of Alan Grant. It's the children, in fact, who represent the ones who are mindful of the past, especially Timmy. He's mindful of the past. He respects dinosaurs. He's read Alan Grant's work, so he's researched. He does live in the present, and he's also accepting the future. Be like Timmy. Annoying as he may be, he is the perfect character to actually emulate or mimic in Jurassic Park because he is the one that has figured out life. It's interesting, however, that he is the youngest character in this film. And it is, in fact, through aging. And it's really funny about the Timmy thing because I actually have a friend who knows the guy who actually played Timmy, and we laugh about it all the time. So that actor, at that time, he's older than me, which is hilarious now. But at the time of Jurassic Park filming, he was the youngest character in that film, and he's the one that is shown to have it figured out. It's funny. It's interesting. We move on. We'll talk about the Raptors. I promise this is going to be a Raptors pod, but I need to lay out the biases at play. A confirmation bias and motivated reasoning. This is from ChatGPT, by the way, this entire thing here. But I wanted to get a comprehensive list of the biases at play here. Management tends to favor data or narratives that confirm pre-existing beliefs and may dismiss contradicting evidence, even if logic or analytics suggest otherwise. In sports, or specifically with the Raptors, this can manifest in sticking to a traditional decision-making methods or ignoring analytics that change the status quo. Groupthink and shared information bias. This thing that is happening with Balmer, there's a lot of groupthink element to this. Everybody invested, so we invested that element. When decision makers are too cohesive or unwilling to challenge previous opinions or prevailing opinions, important dissenting views, hidden information can get overlooked. For instance, a draft bust that goes number one, James Wiseman. Everybody is for it. Same thing with Jalen Suggs, Scotty Barnes. The Raptors have actually shown a great ability to avoid groupthink. I think this is largely due to their corporate structure within their front office having dissenting opinions. Now, the management style under Masai Ujiri allowed for competing opinions to rise and be challenged. They do this at the coaching level as well, where Darko is willing to challenge his coaches to challenge him. It's important that this happens because it prevents groupthink, because the mind of one singular intelligent person can never beat the mind of six committed intelligent people. And so sometimes what intelligent people who are sometimes maybe afraid of being challenged will do is they will suppress the opinions of others, which can lead to tyranny and frankly a lot of groupthink. Recency bias and availability heuristic. So heuristic is like a mental shortcut that you use without really thinking about it. Outweighing very recent events like poor performance stretches or standout games can skew execution in key decisions. Examples, benching players, reevaluating strategies. Again, sticking with something a little bit too long or overreacting immediately to a single good performance. Certain people, for instance, will see I don't know, an RJ Barrett 30-point game where he's super efficient and just forget entirely what he's done for his entire career. They might see 2 or 3 selective plays of good defense and completely ignore the entire sample, whereas other people may have a bias towards RJ being a really bad defender and will ultimately ignore 2 to 3 months of massive improvement on that defensive end because they are committed to seeing RJ as a bad defender. Escalation of commitment. Even when results underperform, decision makers may continue funneling resources into failing approach out of attachment to past investments. For example, delaying rebuilding or doubling down or underperforming personnel or tactics. Again, this was the entire crux of the We the North thing. You didn't need 2017, 18, and 19 to figure out that Dwayne Casey was probably not going to get you over the hump, even though he had done a great job of pulling you up till 2014 and getting Louis the North started and getting Kyle and DeMar their big start. You don't need that. You really don't need that. There's also some biases at play, which, there's an accidental success here to We the North. Like, we have to admit, trading Rudy Gay was not supposed to commence in something. Kyle was not supposed to be a franchise point guard. You tried to trade him precisely because he wasn't a franchise point guard. This wasn't supposed to happen. You sort of found lightning in a bottle and then viewed yourself as geniuses. You did a great job drafting, for instance. 2016, 17, 2015, 16, 17, you did a great job drafting. You found Pascal, you found Fred, you found OG. You invested in an archetype of long armed wings, right? And these long armed wings became better shooters. Siakam became a better shooter. OG became a better shooter. And so you started to build a model where you could turn anybody into a good shooter. And of course, that's not true. But you also started to build a model of scrappy underdogs with long arms leading to championships. You started to think that this might be the way to do it. That's why the Grady Dick and Jacoby Walter, this is important. It's important to break type sometimes because even though there's no one single player who mimics Grady Dick on your championship roster, and there's many Scotty Barnes clones on this championship roster, it's important to realize that yes, there's another way to do it, and the league is always evolving. You have to challenge these things. I do think Bobby is a very forward-thinking guy. I also think Masai had a bit of a past bias. So there's an element of commitment to Casey, commitment to DeMar, commitment to Kyle, commitment to so-and-so and so-and-so. And it's just, it can get in the way. Commitment to Pascal, commitment to Fred, commitment to Jakob, even like this notion of trading for Jakob Poeltl. So the question that I would ask if I was in the Raptors front office is, when the trade offer for Jakob Poeltl comes in and it's this exorbitant, do you pay the same amount if he had never played for you before? Are you trading for the player that is there or the player that you used to know? Masai Ujiri is saying it's like he never left. Jakob Poeltl obviously giving a big middle finger to the Raptors. You choosing the number 19 for the 2019 championship that he was traded away from. There's a lot of past drawn into the decision to trade for Jakob Poeltl. It's a familiar face. It's somebody we know, right? Going and trading for Jakob Poeltl, giving up all of the future assets and the opportunity to draft potentially a Wembanyama or Amen Thompson was the example of examples of bias, because what it is showing you that you clearly have a present value bias in the sense that you want to extract the most out of the core that you have with Fred, Pascal. You want to know. There's also a future aversion to understanding the future cost of your present decision because you cost yourself so much to get Jakob Poeltl. And there's also a strong leaning into the past of trying to reunite Jakob with his old bench mob teammates to make it all click. There's a lot of biases at play. Right? Escalation of commitment, as I said. So optimism bias. An overly positive look can lead front offices to estimate or overestimate future success, underplay weaknesses, or delay tough strategic choices like trades or rebuilds. Again, at what point do you decide that it's a problem that extends beyond coaching when you finish bottom 25 in offense, or sorry, like bottom 5 in offense for like 6 years in a row? At what point is that just a perma problem with your roster and your philosophy, right? You continuously draft players who have major offensive concerns, right? who lean defensively. In back-to-back years, you have acquired three of such players in Jonathan Mobo, Colin Murray Boyles, who have more defensively leaning skill sets. And yet you are not a dominant defense, and yet you continue to be a bottom five offense. Now you finally make a trade for Brandon Ingram, whose offensive spectrum, and of course, Emmanuel Quickly and RJ Barrett. So it's like you're showing a shift. Grady, Jacoby, RJ, IQ, Brandon Ingram all have skill sets that lean more offensively. I think the vast majority of players who played for the Toronto Raptors in their championship run had skill sets that veered more defensively. Even though Gasol is a great passer, his greatest value came defensively. Kawhi might be the one guy whose skill set, because of his incredible development, leaned more offensively. But Danny Green, as a shooter, he was good. As a defender, he was great, right? You consistently traded away offensive talent for defensive upgrades. You traded away Terrence Ross for a better defender in Serge Ibaka. You traded away DeMar DeRozan for a major defensive upgrade in Kawhi and Danny Green. You traded away Jonas Valanciunas again from Marc Gasol, which is again trading offense for defense. Jonas Valanciunas has offensive skill sets and gifts that maybe Marc Gasol didn't have at that point, but Gasol had a much, much greater defensive impact. And so this notion of we did it once before, let's keep doing it, this is who we are, this can become a confirmation bias as well. Because if this is who you are, it sort of makes it so that this is who you have to keep being, right? If I define myself, and this is why your self definition matters so much, define yourself in a positive light. Don't define yourself as an idiot. Don't define yourself as a loser. Don't define yourself as a moron. Don't define yourself as I'm always late. I'm not good at things. I'm not good at math. Why would you ever say you're not good at math? Say, I haven't learned to be good at math yet, because you avoid the definition. See, we have a subconscious bias to sort of line up our own definitions and stay consistent to them. If you ever, here's a cheat sheet. Let's say you have a person in your life who isn't very good to you, right? The natural tendency, let's say you have a person in your life who's not very responsible. Let's say you have a person in your life who's not very ethical. Maybe you have a person in your life who tells too many lies. I think the natural tendency here is to berate them, shame them, and say horrible things to them about the actions. Like, you've hurt me so much with your lies. You're such an irresponsible person. Children are often ridiculed for getting bad grades for this exact reason. Now, here's an alternate strategy which will actually yield much more positive results. Force them to embrace the opposite. It's a little manipulative, but it can work. I know that you'll be on time because you're a reliable person. If they believe it, suddenly they'll have to be, because there's a consistency there. See, it's funny. You're an idiot actually makes somebody less likely to get good grades and study, because you're affirming the negative. And it's funny. When I was in grade 12, grade 11, I had a teacher who initially started out by telling me that I probably shouldn't take her class because it's really hard and that I'm a lazy student, et cetera, because she'd had some past experiences with me. But, when I got into her class the next year, I had a commitment to myself to change her mind about me, and I really wanted to prove her wrong. And then she started to big me up, and she started to say, like, wow, you're a really great writer. I could imagine, reading a book you've written on a Barnes and Noble or Borders bookshelf one day. And it really filled me with all this positivity, and it helped me embrace this idea of being a writer. And it's shortly thereafter that I started writing basketball articles, and then I started writing film scripts, and now I write YouTube scripts. I'm a writer now. I'm a professional writer. Unlike a lot of writers who write for fun, I'm actually paid. I've been paid loads of money to write. It's a huge, huge accomplishment, and something I couldn't have dreamt of when I was 16 years old, that anyone would pay me to write anything. But it's so cool that her telling me that I was a writer allowed me to see myself as a writer. So it's important. Moving on. Illusion of control. Leaders may overestimate their ability to manage outcomes, especially in highly uncertain environments like the NBA. This may trigger overconfident decisions, believing they can shape results beyond what's realistically possible. Turning non-shooters into shooters would be a great example of that. Anchoring effect. Initial judgments such as early draft grades, past reputations, or preconceived ideas of players can disproportionately shape later evaluations, even if the performance data evolves. This is very strongly tied to Brandon Ingram, I'm sorry to say. BI is a number 2 overall pick. He is also a former All-Star. I can also make a very, very strong argument that he is a player who probably doesn't fit into Darko's system unless he radically changes. Assuming radical shift is confidence in Darko, it's confidence in BI, it's trust in both sides. But there is also a world in which he doesn't change, he doesn't cut, he doesn't take more threes. So you're making a calculated gamble, and one could argue, and one has argued because the league is very widely spoken in great criticism of this trade, that he won't change. So the Raptors are betting that they're right when everybody else is wrong. And I'm betting also, because I'm a biased Raptor fan, I am also betting that they are right and that everybody else is wrong. But why? Oh, why am I blurry? Why am I blurry? Okay, sorry, I was blurry for a second there. So the past performance of the last 3 years, there's no rational way that you can make a really solid argument that Brandon Ingram is a better player than his contract, $38 million. You cannot make a case based on the way Brandon Ingram has played the last 3 years that he fits into Darko's offense. You just can't. He's a guy who likes to hold the ball, probe the ball. He is not a player who operates away from the basketball as well as you would necessarily like. He's not a player that cuts or does great stuff defensively. He's not a seamless fit in a team that aspires to be a dominant defense this year. And yeah, the health concerns are scary. So you're betting on a lot of things going right for you that haven't gone right in New Orleans. And I think it's a fine bet. I think it's a fine bet. You didn't give up a lot. You did, however, sign him to a lot of money. I can make a very strong argument that it is an overpay. Based on the player he has been, that is a massive overpay. And there's a reason why the Raptors were the only team willing to offer him that contract because nobody else would. And Rich Paul spoke on that. I think the best contract that Brandon Ingram was going to get based on the 3 seasons he's had, based on his age and injury history, was probably $27 million. And I think that would be generous. Given the current cap climate in terms of how teams are paying players, $27 to $30 million would be a maximum commitment that a team is willing to make in Brandon Ingram. Please don't forget that the Spurs were apprehensive in 2017 to give Kawhi a supermax contract. And Kawhi is 10 times the player in 2017 that Brandon Ingram has ever been. So the issue here is there is this idea that things will magically fall into place. And I understand certain people who've looked at this team deeply over the last couple of years and say, no, they won't. And I also understand my optimism as a Raptor content creator to say, yeah, they will, because I really, really believe in Darko. I believe in Scotty. I believe in Brandon Ingram. I believe that these people are well-intentioned people with a lot of skill. And I do believe that team culture and team chemistry can influence a lot of that. I do think also that the elements of who are you around on a day-to-day basis can influence you. I think that, positive team cultures bring out the best in players. And I don't think we've seen the best in Brandon Ingram. I also have a very, very disfavorable relationship, or not relationship, opinion of Willie Green, Brandon Ingram's previous coach. I also believe that the part is greater than the whole. Like we've seen this many times with the Raptors, right? The parts are greater than the individual pieces. Sorry, that's not right. The whole is greater than the sum of the parts. Like, so basically, I know there's a correct phrase there, but I'm missing it right now. The point here is the Raptors will outperform their individual talent because of synergistic fit, chemistry, conference strength, all sorts of stuff, continuity from last year, and straight up just trying harder. I mean, it's a little bit like saying my C student will be a B student because, he wants it more next year. I don't know. I don't know. Familiarity heuristic. Clinging to familiar players, staff, or strategies because they're known can undercut innovation or necessary change. Stickiness to familiar faces or frames of thinking might limit agility. This might be the Bobby Webster hiring in a nutshell, right? Bobby Webster is absolutely a part of every decision the Raptors have made for the last 8 years, 9 years, including the championship decisions, including the disastrous decisions, including Malachi Flynn, including Kem Birch, including Jakob Poeltl. To view him as apart from that is, frankly, mental gymnastics. To view him as above it, to say, well, he did this and that. Like, this is the same thing as Nurse and Casey in a lot of ways. People were apprehensive initially when the Raptors chose Nick Nurse, because they said, well, how much more of an improvement can there really be? He was there. He was the one designing the defensive sets. He was the one doing this and that. But I don't know if we'll ever know if Dwayne Casey could have won a championship with the Toronto Raptors because he really didn't have Kawhi Leonard. And in all the sets that DeMar DeRozan ran, Kawhi Leonard is so much better than DeMar DeRozan. I can't even explain to you how much better he is than DeRozan. But put it very frankly, and this is no disrespect to DeMar, the analytics would tell you that Danny Green in 2019 was about as good, if not a better player than DeMar DeRozan. Your eye test won't agree with that because you're not looking at what Danny Green does or how he operates. But the DeMar DeRozan stuff is very interesting because DeMar DeRozan represents a great, great example of bias. Let's talk about DeMar DeRozan and the bias that stems from his time in Toronto. It's interesting. When you talk about DeMar DeRozan, people have very split opinions. Either he was the guy who could never make it happen in the playoffs, or, he was this phenomenal, team guy. And two things can be true. He is a phenomenal team guy. He is a foundational piece to your Raptors, We the North culture. He was a big time bucket getter. He also wasn't very efficient. He was a bit of a playoff dropper. In fact, a significant playoff dropper, and he has been so in every situation. DeMar DeRozan is the perfect example of empty calorie scoring with very little defense and spacing. And when we try to get away from the biases of eye test, because DeMar's game is very pretty, and Scotty's game is very clunky, and Fred's game is very unappetizing. You know what I mean? And Pascal's game can be a little bit repetitive. DeMar DeRozan passes the eye test of any person who's ever played basketball, that this guy is a certified hooper. And I understand why certain people swear that this guy is the most underrated player in NBA history because he has damn near 30,000 points. The problem with DeMar is he doesn't impact his team offense in the way that players with his usage do. When you look at a Russell Westbrook, even with all of his decision-making gaffes and all that stuff, there is a significant amount of improvement in terms of the pressure he places on the paint. DeMar doesn't do that. There is a significant efficiency with players like Durant and Ingram, above and beyond the DeMar archetype. There is a shot quality differential between DeMar and other A1 stars. And that's what really held the Raptors back in a lot of ways because you really can't mask superstar touches being taken by non-superstars. It's a really difficult thing. And the Raptors are finding that out with Scotty Barnes to a lesser degree because Scotty obviously offensively as a scorer is not a superstar. My opinion of him as a superstar comes down to his overall impact, his impact on defense and team culture and, passing, connectivity, rebounding, versatility. He's not a superstar in offense. So when you run offenses through non-superstars as if they are superstars, i.e., isolation possessions, on-ball possessions, pull-up jumpers, etc., just as you found out with Pascal Siakam, you don't end up with a good offense. What is it that you need to generate good offense? This is not necessarily a 25 point per game score. What you need is a 25 point per game impact score, which is to say, someone like a Jason Kidd. See, Jason Kidd was never, ever a 20 point per game scorer. You have a bias, probably, if you're like most NBA fans, towards the number 20 when it comes to scoring. It was viewed for a very long time as a benchmark of a scorer. If you scored less than that, you were a non-scorer. If you scored more than that, you were a good scorer. If you scored significantly above that, you were a great scorer. But that's not necessarily true because scoring is a function of offensive attempts. So if you take a lot of shots that you shouldn't be taking, it's pretty easy to rack up 20 points, but you don't create the same impact as a Jason Kidd does when he scores 15 points. Because Kidd, as pointed out in Thinking Basketball's last podcast, or 3-4 podcasts ago, impacted his team significantly because with him on the court, do you know that with Jason Kidd on the court, the at the time New Jersey Nets scored 10 points per 100 possessions more at the rim, even though he didn't even account for 20% of those scoring chances himself. His mere presence on the court opened up the paint. How? His decision-making, passing, early push and transition, his speed created that. So when you look at the box score and you see Jason Kidd had 14 points, 13 rebounds, and then you look on the other side and Ron Mercer had 19 points, you might assume that Ron Mercer made more of an impact on offense, but he didn't. He never did, ever. There's not one game that I can think of where Ron Mercer outplayed Jason Kidd. But that's the bias of big numbers. We have big number bias. We have an analytics bias. Some people swear by analytics and they think it is the be all end all. They don't care that a guy scored 25 or 15. If it's a high box score, high box plus minus, high VORP, high EPM, they're for it. And, this is the Nikola Jokic thing, right? It's the same thing with how we view Nikola Jokic. I think it's a great example. Jokic is not a great defender. He is, of course, also a generational offensive player, like truly a 101 in NBA history. There's nothing like him that has ever existed in the NBA in terms of the volume of attempts and the differential, the different difficulty of passes and the sheer quality of offense that he generates is absolutely insane. And yet, people can't stop harping on this idea that this near 7-footer doesn't block shots. That's a bias. It's an archetype bias. You have a bias that centers need to block shots. Not all centers blocked a lot of shots. It's interesting that defense can often be resulted like your understanding of defense is rooted in your counting of blocks and steals. But Dennis Rodman once won Defensive Player of the Year, multiple Defensive Players of the Years, and in the year, one of the years he won Defensive Player of the Year, he didn't average a single steal or a single block. Scotty averaged over a steal and a block per game last year, if I remember correctly. He's had several seasons like that, but Rodman beat out players who had 4 blocks per game. How was he able to do this? How was he able to accrue such low block numbers and steal numbers? Is it because teams overvalued his rebounding? I don't know. I don't know per se. But watching Dennis Rodman, it's obvious to me that he's a phenomenal defender that earned every Defensive Player of the Year that he actually got. And yet, leave it to some people today to say Hakeem was actually a much, much, much better defender in the years that he won. I think that's up for discussion. But if your argument roots on 4 blocks per game, you've lost me immediately because that's not all defense is. And just like with Scotty, that's not all offense is, right? So again, like when you have a past bias, present bias, future bias, these things manifest themselves very interestingly. For instance, I often talk about the delayed gratification, or you're the person, I used to say to my girlfriend, I'm like, you're the person who ate the stale donuts, right? My girlfriend and I constantly go back and forth about money. This is something that we constantly have debates about, fights about, threats about, which is how we view money today versus in the past versus in the future. Here's my view on money. My view on money is an opportunity. Money is something that gives you options. To my girlfriend, money is something that gives her objects. So it's the debate constantly comes down to why do we spend this? Why don't we save for this? Why don't we take a vacation? Why don't we do this? Why are we working so hard, et cetera, et cetera? But really, it's a fundamental debate between objects versus options. I prefer options. She prefers objects. Her present bias towards, this thing now, right? If something goes on sale, she will buy it right away. Why? Because she is afraid that in the future it will not be at the same price, that the price will go up and that she'll be missing it. We discount things, we discount, like if I ask you right now, would you rather $100 today or $10 a week for the next 12 weeks? I think that's pretty simple calculus, right? You take the $120 over almost 3 months, and then you ask yourself, what is the present value of money to me? Now, your decision could change drastically depending on your need for money. If you're wealthy, probably you take the $120 over 4 weeks. If you're desperately poor and need to pay rent and groceries, you take the $100 today. I think credit card companies and payday loans have built the entire financial model based on people's present value bias. They don't think about the future. They think I'll pay it off. They rack up their credit cards. You might rack up your credit card. You might make a decision today that is going to hurt you 3 weeks from now, but you view the hurt 3 weeks from now as less than the hurt today. It is, but by how much? If the cost of borrowing $1,000 today is nothing a month from now, you'd be stupid not to borrow the $1,000 and then pay it back, especially if you're good with money and know how to grow $1,000 over the course of a month properly. And if you have something to fall back on in case your growth strategy doesn't work. But if the cost of borrowing $1,000 is 28% every single month, you'd be crazy to do it unless you had an absolutely airtight reason to do so. A medical emergency, perhaps. A family member needs surgery. These are the things that cripple people's credit scores and people's bank balances and can frankly ruin people's lives. If if we took the time to teach people about biases in school, I think the financial system would pretty much collapse in a positive way. I think it would be much better because people would learn what am I giving up to get something right now? What are you giving up? So again, the Clippers are the perfect example of present value bias. They didn't care about Shea. I mean, they cared a little bit, but they didn't care enough that they were giving up a player that had been in their gym and was going to likely be an all-star. I mean, there were reports at the time that believed him to be a future all-star. And clearly, if the OKC Thunder, who drafted Kevin Durant and James Harden and Russell Westbrook and Serge Ibaka are looking at this guy as a centerpiece in a trade for Paul George, you're probably like the stupidest people in the world to not see that as a red flag. That they want this guy for a reason because they see something in him, and we also see that in him. But you say no, we get Kawhi. The pitch from Lawrence Frank to Steve Ballmer when Ballmer looked at the offer the OKC Thunder were trying to squeeze. I mean, the OKC Thunder are the real winners here. They won a championship out of this. Do you know how many rounds the OKC Thunder won last year? 4. You know how many rounds Kawhi Leonard has won since he's become a Clipper in 2019? 3. That's the crazy part, right? So when you make this trade for Paul George, right? How did Lawrence Frank sell it to Ballmer? Ballmer was initially shocked at the price, right? He was shocked that they had to give up Shea and 5 first-round picks and Gallinari and all this stuff. He said, that's a lot for Paul George. That's too much for Paul George. And Lawrence Frank said, don't think of it as this is what you're paying for Paul George. Rather, think of it as what you are paying for Paul George and Kawhi Leonard. At which point, Ballmer said, okay, why? Well, in that moment, Kawhi was coming off a historic run with the Toronto Raptors, and which culminated in the championship. Does the thinking on the Clippers side of Kawhi the savior, Kawhi the, as opposed to a year ago, which was Kawhi the pariah, Kawhi the malcontent, Kawhi the big question mark, Kawhi the big health scare, does that thinking go away if the Raptors don't win a championship? If that shot against Philly clanks out and the Raptors end up being bounced in the second round? I don't know if he's viewed as the savior, but maybe he still is. Maybe not so much, though. Maybe the desperation level goes up. There's also a present bias, which is I want to make the Clippers relevant. Steve Ballmer earns over $1 billion a year in stock dividends from Microsoft stock. You need to understand what $1 billion means to this man. It means very little. So when you think about it from that perspective, in that moment, they made a calculated risk, gamble, whatever, towards the present by sacrificing the future and ignoring the past, ignoring, of course, that such deals often backfire. Deals like this have backfired. And if you're an NBA general manager today or a president today, you can probably guess that deals like this, which involve 4 or 5 first-round picks and young players, will often backfire. There's an old tried and true not tried and true, there's a believed rule. It's all almost a wives' tale at this point, that if you get the best player back in a trade, you won the trade. They did get the best player back in the trade, but they lost the trade. The Nets got the best player back when they traded for Kevin Durant. They also lost the trade. The Suns got back the best player in Kevin Durant. They also lost the trade. Once again, if you examine biases, is there maybe a projection bias going on here? If you think about it, that in the past, before 5, 6 first-round picks and great young players were involved in deals, that typically, when you trade Vince Carter for Eric Williams, Aaron Williams, and 2 first-round picks, you do win the trade. But if you involve 6 first-round picks in that trade, you don't win the trade. You see, there's like a limit to a rule that you're completely ignoring when you make these hard and fast rules. So how does this apply to the Toronto Raptors? Well, obviously, I've already outlined in many ways how it does, but I want to outline how it does to me because I believe that I have a future bias. And I want to explain this future bias to you in the context of my work over the last 4 years and how I always seem to arrive at different conclusions than other people who cover the Toronto Raptors. Specifically, I don't want to talk about the clowns and the horse and pony show, but the people that I respect in this space often arrive at very different conclusions than me. People like Samson Boak and Louis Zatzman will often come to very different conclusions about what the Raptors are doing, what they're going to do, how they're doing, what the projections are on how they will do, whether they're a championship contender, whether Scotty's a franchise player, whether Ingram trade is good, whether RJ trade is good, whether they should hold on to OG, whether Darko's doing a good job. Again, when I talk about myself on one extreme and Doug Smith, Michael Grange, Blake Murphy, Samson Folk, Louis Zatzman, William Liu, all these guys on the other side, there is a great divide in terms of how I often view things versus how I don't. It's interesting when I started this channel that I was firmly against what the Raptors were doing. I did not like it. I thought the offense was broken. They needed to make trades. They needed to get rid of everybody, blah, 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 blah. That was me on one side. Why was I on that side? Because I have a future bias. Because I have a very strong future bias. I have a projection bias and I have a future bias. My projection bias is explaining to me that players like Siakam and players like VanVleet, based on their personality types and game types, do not age well into their 30s and will never be good enough to lead a championship team. My future bias orients my discussion around the Raptors and ultimately their hopes and future around Scotty Barnes, as opposed to the average fan who probably had more of a present bias when they were talking about Siakam versus Barnes. When I said Barnes should be elevated into the first option and given run and opportunity because he needs to find out who he is, and ultimately the Raptors are cooked if he doesn't work out. When I was doing that, I obviously had a projection bias because I project that Scotty Barnes, like Kawhi Leonard and other similar types of athletes in the past, and maybe Giannis Antetokounmpo and all the players that I project him to be, that this is the type of player that can lead you to a championship. Listen, if the Raptors had drafted Terrence Ross as opposed to Scotty Barnes, I would be crying for us to keep Pascal because there's no hope going with Terrence Ross. Ross's game doesn't project to franchise savior, first option, all-star, all-NBA. Doesn't have that. Scotty's game, to me, did. And I noticed this in him when he was 17 years old. So I have a very strong projection bias based on how players like Scotty go forward. And I have a very strong future bias, which is I don't care about the present of pissing off Fred VanVleet or losing Siakam or losing his role or diminishing his role or diminishing his contract because I don't care about the present. I'm more oriented on the concept of championships in the future. And it's interesting that while all of this was happening between the Raptors fan base, we had Masai Ujiri working with a past bias, which is to say the obligation to preserve the championship core, be loyal to people, things were the way they were, operating with nostalgia, regret aversion. If we let go of Siakam, we'll regret it because he'll go somewhere else and make us look stupid, which he kind of did, but be patient. And so we stuck and we played out the status quo. That's the reality. So when Samson Folk or someone of his caliber breaks down game film and looks at the Toronto Raptors last year, what I think, and again, I'm not diagnosing somebody here, but I think there's a very strong bias towards the present. That's why I think Samson and Louis Zatzman were, like, hey, Davion's around, Davion's going to stick around, Davion provides value, etc. Davion will command $12 million. Davion's a part of this. And I was like, they're going to ship him out. He doesn't fit this. That's why I said they're going to ship out Dennis because he doesn't fit this. And again, once again, how have I been able to project with some degree of accuracy the players that fit and the players that don't? Why was I against Gary sticking around long term? Why was I against Davion, Dennis, Fred, Pascal? Why was I against these players sticking around long term? Because I understand the biases at play and I understand my own biases. And I understand, I think at least, that as the Raptors have moved away from Siakam and Fred, they also now have the same bias that I have, which is a projection bias and a future bias. Now, what will happen if the Raptors come out this year and Scotty doesn't take a step up? What will happen if Pascal Siakam now thrust into a first option role and the de facto leader without a stretch big, by the way, of Miles Turner, but kudos to Jay Huff, who is also a stretch big. What will in fact happen if Siakam flourishes in that situation and Ingram and Barnes fail, and the Pacers somehow, without Halliburton, without Turner, finish ahead of the Raptors, what will happen is a lot of people are going to turn against me, turn against my coverage, turn against my analysis, turn against Scotty, turn against Darko, turn against Bobby, turn against MLSC, turn against the Raptors. There's a lot on the line here. There's a competing war of ideals in terms of what's important. I'll give you my rationale for why it doesn't matter whether I'm right or wrong. I'm right anyway. Sounds kind of egotistical, but let's lean into it. If you believe, for some reason, that the Raptors should go away from Barnes as a franchise focal point, offensive focal point, take the ball out of his hands and use him exactly how he's used, which is, I hear this at least 5 times a day in some mention or some comment somewhere. Scotty needs to stop taking jumpers. Scotty needs to stop taking threes. He needs to get his butt in the post. He needs to be off ball. He needs to be a third option, embrace his Draymond future. Okay, cool. Let me tell you why that's a really bad idea, even though you swear it's a great idea. I'll tell you why. Because there's no championship with him playing that way. It will never happen. It cannot happen, in my opinion. Again, using my future and projection bias forward, Draymond Green cannot be the best player on a championship team. Can't happen. So if you nudge Scotty into Draymond trajectory and Draymond projections, you're not going to win a championship or ever sniff a championship because Draymond Green cannot be the championship number one. And Steph Curry's don't grow on trees. So if you're hoping to replicate the Jokic, Giannis, Kawhi archetype, now there is a chance. Now, if the goal is championships and not merely 42 wins and fizzle out without a chance in hell, but actual championships, you should be very, very vested in this idea of Scotty as morphing into a superstar. And you should be, as Darko is, willing to experiment as long as it takes until the experiment fails. I'm not guaranteeing you that Scotty will be a superstar or that he'll ever be a 25 point per game player. I am almost certain that if you put the ball in Brandon Ingram's hands, he could do that right now. But like DeMar DeRozan, to a much lesser degree, I want to clarify, I think Ingram is different than DeMar. But like DeMar, I do not believe that Brandon Ingram possesses either the age, trajectory, health, or frankly, the game to be the best player on a championship team. I do not believe that playing Ingram isolation ball will make you a bad team. It'll actually make you a better team. He can single-handedly, if you take the ball out of Scotty's hands from a offensive scoring pull-up perspective and just hand all those possessions to Ingram, you immediately get better. And some people are very seduced by the idea of getting better because they're tired of being bad. But the thing here is getting better should be a motion towards an outcome, right? Giannis playing point guard, Wemby playing point guard were decisions that their respective teams, in this case, the Milwaukee Bucks under Jason Kidd, and then ultimately the San Antonio Spurs, these are decisions these organizations made, even though that was not the final form of those players. And people really cried about it. Using Giannis as a point guard, using Wemby as a point guard. Oh, what are they doing? The Spurs are stupid. And now Wemby is a top 7 player by most accounts, and people really ignored that early development that Wemby went through. It's not that you think Wemby will become a point guard. It's just that you're nudging his development in the right direction. And sometimes development requires you to do something that runs counterproductive to the present. It didn't make any sense. Now, what if the Spurs were a different team? What if they had different ideals, different focus, different mindset, different management? What if they said, listen, we just drafted this number 1 overall pick, and you know what would be really, really great? We make the playoffs right away. How's that for our brand? Everyone's interested in this Wemby guy. Let's do the stupidest thing in the world and let's rush his development. Let's turn him into a role player, but a superstar defensive role player, because that's what he can do right now. He can block shots and impact. Wemby was an impact defender out of the box, but he was a clunky offensive player who had a lot of holes in his offensive game. And so what they did was they prioritized the future of dynasties with Wemby. If you want to look at the OKC Thunder, they did the exact same thing. Shai Gilgeous-Alexander has been good enough for 3 years now to lead a championship offense, and yet it is only last year that they really opened up the window for him to do so. Why? Because his supporting cast wasn't ready. So even if you believed in your heart of hearts that Shea was good enough to make it to the playoffs and pull you through a couple of series, J Dub and Chet weren't ready. He needs support. So last year they opened the window. How do they do that? They pay more money. They pay off the future, a little bit of the future for the present. They trade, Josh Giddey for Alex Caruso. That is a much older player with a much lower ceiling, but a much more valuable skill set in terms of complementary role player. And so they sign Isaiah Hartenstein to an exorbitant contract, which is very expensive. $27 million a year for Isaiah Hartenstein is insane money. But because your other players are so cheap, J Dub, Chet, etc., and his deal runs with theirs, you can get away with it. And that's the beauty of what the Raptors are doing. So that even if Scotty doesn't turn into a star, you have to find out. You have to find out. You cannot cut this process short because you're trying to chase the immediate gratification of a playoff berth. You have to try this out because there's no other player on your team, in my humble opinion, that can be the best player on a championship team. There is no other player that can affect the court the way he can. So even if you believe that RJ is better at some of his possessions, which I will 100% agree with you, even if you believe that Ingram is a better offensive player right now, which I 100% agree with, he's 23, whereas the players you're comparing him to are 6-year and 8-year, 9-year pros. You need to actually just dance with this for a second and realize, yeah, there might be a little bit of projecting going on here. And yeah, there's definitely quite a bit of future bias going on here where, the guy who was against Fred's 2020 game because of what it meant for the future probably isn't going to see this very clearly because I definitely don't see the present very clearly at times. I'm trying my best. And I hope that by acknowledging this and by going through the process of understanding and examining biases, you can better understand your own life and your own fandom of this team. Do you have a present bias, past bias, a future bias, or a projection bias? Do you have one of the other biases? Do you have one of these biases, a confirmation bias, a groupthink, shared information bias? Do you have a recency bias, an available heuristic, escalation of commitment, optimism bias, illusion of control, anchoring bias, familiarity heuristic? Or do you simply have a racial bias, a gender bias? I'm not against biases. In fact, I believe very strongly that they will always exist as long as we live. Most of them are pretty harmless, actually. And the only part of a bias that can really hurt your life, in my opinion, is when you don't acknowledge that you have one. I'll talk to y'all later. Thank you so much, Mike McGonigal, for becoming a YouTube member. I appreciate you. I do want to quickly give a nice little shout out to all of our recent members. Hang on one second. I got you. Got you. Little video here. Give me one sec. One sec. Mute that. So this is all of our new members. Thank you very, very much. We are 75% of our way towards our membership quota. We wanted to get to 100 members before September 16th. And as I said, 74%. We are 74% of the way there, if not counting gifted memberships. So we have 26 to go. And I will continue to drop content and I will continue to push because I want this. I want this. In fact, the only thing I thought about yesterday was, why did I aim for 100? If the quota was 100, why did I aim for 100? I'll probably fail if I aim for 100. Maybe in my mind, I'm saying 100, but really I should be aiming for 200. I'll talk to y'all later. Enjoy, and thank you to everybody who tuned in live. Peace. And let me know below which bias is impacting your life and how is it impacting your life? Which bias is impacting you as a fan? Do you have a future bias and a projection bias like me, or do you have a past bias and a familiarity bias like Masai Ujiri? Peace.